The answer was already written. It had been sitting in a storage drawer in the basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology for decades before anyone fully understood what it said. The fragment is catalogued as N2986. It is a piece of baked clay, roughly the size of a human palm, covered in tiny wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the surface some 4,000 years ago. The clay is the colour of old bone. The edges are broken, as though someone dropped it, though dropped is perhaps the wrong word for something that survived the collapse of an entire civilization, centuries of burial beneath 30 feet of Mesopotamian earth, and a 19th century excavation conducted partly by candlelight in the middle of the Iraqi desert. Wherever you are listening from tonight, and whatever hour it is where you are, whether you are lying in a quiet room or just beginning to let the day dissolve, the words on that fragment were pressed into wet clay by a scribe who may have been no older than you. The scribe sat in a room in a city called Nippur, which no longer exists above ground, and copied down something that the people around them treated not as poetry, not as fiction, not as myth in the way we use that word, but as a record, as something that had happened, as something that would happen again. The fragment is a portion of a longer text. When scholars assembled its companion pieces, drawn from over 50 separate clay fragments scattered across museums in Philadelphia, London and Jena, Germany, they reconstructed a text running to 412 lines. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature catalogues it as composition 1.4.1. Most people, if they have heard of it at all, know it by the name scholars gave it in translation, Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld. But here is what the title does not tell you. This text does not merely describe a goddess's journey. It describes what happens at the border between the living world and the dead one. It describes what is taken from a consciousness as it passes through, layer by layer, and what remains. It names the judges who preside over the dead. It names them specifically as the Anunnaki. And that word, that specific designation, appears not only in this text. It appears in multiple independent Sumerian compositions, written by different scribes at different times in different cities, all converging on the same answer. The Anunnaki were not simply gods of the sky or earth in the way that word is loosely used in popular discussions. In the context of death, in the context of what happens to human consciousness after the body stops, the tablets are remarkably consistent. The Anunnaki were the ones who decided what happened next. What follows is an investigation of what those tablets actually say, not what popular culture has made of them, not what ancient astronaut theorists have proposed, not what dismissive scholarship sometimes waves away as merely mythological. We are going to stay as close as possible to the clay, to what was pressed into it, to what it meant to the people who pressed it. And we are going to let the questions that emerge remain open. Because on a night like this, with the weight of the day beginning to lift, there is something appropriate about sitting with a 4,000-year-old question that nobody has fully answered. The Sumerians believed they knew what happened to human consciousness after death. They encoded that belief with extraordinary specificity, not in vague assurances of paradise, not in symbolic illusion alone, but in procedural detail that reads less like religion and more like a technical manual. The procedure had gates. It had gatekeepers with names. It had a checklist. It had judges. And it had an outcome that depended, with precision that would have made a bureaucrat proud, on exactly how a person had lived, and whether anyone remembered them after they were gone. The clay holds the answer. Let us read it together. A civilization that should not exist. There is a problem at the beginning of Sumerian history, and scholars have been noting it quietly for over a century. The problem is not that the Sumerians lacked a history. The problem is that the one they had does not fit the pattern that civilization is supposed to follow. The conventional model of civilizational development, the one taught in introductory courses and assumed in most popular accounts, describes a gradual accumulation. Hunter-gatherers settle. Small agricultural communities form. Villages grow into towns. Towns develop specialization. Over centuries or millennia, writing emerges from the need to keep records. Architecture becomes more sophisticated. Religious and political structures slowly elaborate. Each development builds on the last in a reasonably predictable progression. The Sumerians, as best as archaeology can determine, did not follow this trajectory in the way the model predicts. What emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, sometime around 35 to 3200 BC, was not a gradual elaboration. It was something closer to an arrival. Within a relatively compressed period, the region produced the world's first writing system, the first wheel-based transportation, the first formal legal codes, the first schools, the first literary compositions written and preserved by name, the first astronomical records, the first medical texts, the first system of mathematics capable of handling multiplication and division, and an administrative apparatus of sufficient sophistication to manage the logistics of feeding and coordinating urban populations of tens of thousands of people. The city of Eridu, which Sumerian tradition consistently identifies as the first city ever built, has been dated archaeologically to approximately 5400 BCE. Excavations at the site have revealed grave goods in the burials of that period, miniature pottery, clay figurines, joints of meat placed deliberately with the dead. Scholar Gwendolyn Leake, in her extensive work on Mesopotamian urban history, noted these early burial practices as evidence of a structured belief system operating long before the writing system appeared to record it. The care taken in those burials, the objects placed for use in whatever came next, implies a very specific understanding that something survives, that the person who lay in that grave was going somewhere and would need things when they arrived. This matters for the question of where Sumerian cosmological knowledge came from, and it matters specifically because the Sumerians themselves had a very clear answer to that question. Their own texts insist that what they knew was not invented, it was given. The Sumerian king list, a document preserved most completely in an artifact known as the Weld Blundell Prism, catalogued under Museum number WB444 and currently held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, describes a sequence of kings stretching back before a great flood to a period when kingship descended from heaven. The phrasing is deliberate and consistent. The Sumerians did not describe themselves as having worked out the principles of civilization through trial and error. They described receiving them. The word most often used in this context is the Sumerian term me, a concept for which there is no clean English equivalent. The me were broadly the fundamental principles underlying all civilized activity, kingship, priesthood, the art of descent to the underworld, the scribal arts, the musical arts, law, truth, the art of bronze working, and, listed alongside these civic functions, treated with equal weight, the knowledge of what happens after death. The me were not invented by human beings, according to the Sumerian texts. They were held by the gods, distributed to cities, and maintained through divine institution. The god Enki, lord of wisdom, and of the subterranean freshwaters called the Abzu, is described in multiple texts as the keeper and distributor of the me. His house at Eridu, the Abzu, or House of the Abzu, was simultaneously a temple and what the texts describe as a repository of the fundamental knowledge underlying civilization. When Inanna, in the composition called Inanna and the God of Wisdom, travels to Eridu and receives the me from Enki, the list she carries away includes among them the descent to the underworld and the ascent from the underworld. The art of navigating death was not separate from civilization. It was one of its constitutive elements. This framing is worth dwelling on because it shapes everything that follows. When the Sumerian scribes wrote about what happens to consciousness after death, They were not speculating. They were not offering comfort mythology to soothe a frightened public. They were recording something they considered to be established knowledge that had been transmitted to them from a source they described with precision, even if that source remains, for us, deeply ambiguous. The scribes who pressed wedge after wedge into the clay fragments that would eventually end up in basement drawers in Philadelphia and London were performing an act they understood as preservation, not invention. The question of who or what gave humanity the me, the question of the Anunnaki's nature, is one this investigation will return to. For now, it is enough to note that the civilization which produced the most detailed ancient account of post-death consciousness understood itself to be, in a precise sense, a recipient of that knowledge rather than its author. Geographically, Sumer occupied the alluvial plain of what is now southern Iraq, between roughly the 31st and 33rd parallels north, bounded by the Tigris to the east and the Euphrates running roughly through its centre. The land was flat, prone to flooding, almost entirely devoid of stone or timber. It was, in material terms, one of the least favourable environments imaginable for the construction of a major civilization. It had no mountains for quarrying, no forests for building, no natural defences. What it had was exceptionally fertile soil when properly managed, and a network of rivers that, once canalised, could support agriculture on a scale sufficient to feed large urban populations. The cities that emerged on this plain between 3500 and 2000 BC, Eridu, Uruk, Ur-Nippur, Lagash, Kish, Adab, Ummah, Shuruppak, were not the mud brick villages of a developing culture. Uruk, at its height around 3000 BC, covered approximately 6 square kilometres and may have housed a population of up to 50,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on earth for its time. Its temples, built on raised platforms called ziggurats, were visible for miles across the flat plain. Its administration processed thousands of clay tablets per year, tracking livestock, grain, labour and temple offerings. Its scribal schools produced graduates capable of writing in a system of over 800 distinct signs, capable of performing complex calculations, capable of copying the compositions about death, and the gods that would 4,000 years later be dug out of the ground and slowly, painstakingly read again. The Sumerian language itself is an isolate. Unlike the Semitic languages, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, that would eventually replace it, Sumerian has no known relatives. It does not belong to any language family that modern linguistics has been able to identify. It appeared in the archaeological record with the first writing, and it disappeared as a spoken language sometime around 2000 to 1800 BCE, surviving only in the liturgical and scholarly compositions preserved in temple libraries. This linguistic isolation is, for some researchers, another anomaly in the Sumerian emergence question. Languages, like civilizations, typically evolve from antecedents. Sumerians' antecedents, if they existed, left no recoverable trace. What is not anomalous is the remarkable internal consistency of the knowledge preserved in these texts, across centuries of composition, across dozens of independent scribal traditions in different cities. The Sumerian account of death, of what happens to human consciousness when the body ceases, remains strikingly coherent. The same place names appear, the same gatekeepers are named, the same judges are identified, the same hierarchy of outcomes, who fares well and who suffers, is repeated in composition after composition. This consistency does not resolve the question of where the knowledge came from, but it does suggest that whatever the scribes were writing down, they believed they were all writing about the same thing. Wedge by wedge, how the tablets were recovered. The story of how we came to be able to read these texts at all is itself a remarkable piece of history, one that deserves more attention than it usually receives, because understanding the recovery process helps calibrate how much confidence we can reasonably place in the translations. The answer, after more than a century and a half of scholarship, is, A great deal, though not absolute certainty, and that honest uncertainty is part of what makes this investigation genuinely open. The decipherment of cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system used by the Sumerians and their successors, began not in Mesopotamia, but on a cliff face in what is now western Iran. In the 1830s and 1840s, a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson undertook the extraordinary and physically dangerous work of copying and eventually deciphering a massive trilingual inscription carved into the rock face at Behistun, ordered by the Achaemenid king Darius I around 520 BC. The inscription recorded the same royal proclamation in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian Akkadian. Old Persian could be read through comparative analysis with later Iranian languages. Once it yielded its secrets, it provided a key to the Akkadian. And Akkadian, which used an adapted form of the Sumerian cuneiform writing system, eventually provided a bridge to the older Sumerian language itself. By the 1850s, enough of the cuneiform writing system had been decoded that when George Smith, an assistant in the British Museum who had taught himself cuneiform by working evenings in the collection rooms, sat down one day in 1872 with a clay fragment from the excavations at Nineveh, he was able to read lines that described a great flood, strikingly similar to the biblical account of Noah. The discovery caused a sensation. It was the first time a secular modern audience grasped that the clay tablets held stories, not just administrative records, not just tax lists and grain inventories, but literature, cosmology, the oldest stories in the world. The Nineveh tablets, including the famous flood account, came from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, assembled in the 7th century at his capital near modern Mosul. They were Akkadian compositions, many of them translations and adaptations of earlier Sumerian originals. The originals themselves, the Sumerian language compositions, many of them older by 1,000 years or more, were waiting in another city, one that would not be systematically excavated for another generation. That city was Nippur. Nippur occupied a special position in Sumerian religious geography. It was the city of Enlil, the chief of the divine assembly, the god whose word set the fates of nations. It was the centre of Sumerian scribal education. It was where the canonical versions of major literary compositions were established, copied and preserved, and it sat for millennia under a set of low mounds in the middle of the Iraqi desert, some 160 kilometres southeast of Baghdad, undisturbed except by the passage of time and the gradual creep of sand. In 1888, the University of Pennsylvania organised what would become the first major American archaeological expedition to the ancient Near East. The driving force was John Peters, a professor of Hebrew who had spent years lobbying for such an expedition. The logistics were formidable, the region was politically complex, the terrain difficult, and the methods of excavation were, by contemporary standards, rough. The first season in 1889 was nearly disastrous. The expedition's camp was attacked, equipment was damaged, and the team barely retrieved what they had found before retreating. But what they had found was extraordinary. From the Nippur Mounds, over the course of 4 major expeditions between 1889 and 1900, the University of Pennsylvania team and their Ottoman counterparts excavated approximately 30,000 clay tablets and fragments. The Pennsylvania Gazette, in a 2003 retrospective, noted the eventual total would grow to around 60,000 tablets and fragments over subsequent decades of excavation at the site. These were not administrative documents. A significant portion of them were literary, religious and educational texts, the scribal curriculum of the Sumerian scribal schools, the so-called adab or tablet houses, where young men spent years learning to copy the canonical compositions of Sumerian literature. The tablets arrived in Philadelphia split, per agreement with the Ottoman authorities, between what would become the University of Pennsylvania Museum, now the Penn Museum, and institutions in Istanbul. Those in Philadelphia were catalogued under the designation CBS, the initials standing for the Catalogue of the Babylonian section. Tablets numbered CBS 9869, CBS 13121, CBS 1459, CBS 13116, and CBS 15360, among others, all turned out to be fragments of the same literary composition, the text now known as Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, ECCSL 1.8.1.4, one of the most extraordinary documents about the experience of death that has ever been recovered. The decipherment of the Sumerian language was, in comparison to the Akkadian, considerably more difficult. Samuel Noah Kramer, who would become the preeminent Sumerologist of the 20th century, spent decades working in museum basements, assembling fragments, cleaning clay, holding pieces up to raking light to make out the impressions, and slowly building the translations that would, in the 1940s and 1950s, begin to reveal to a modern audience what the Sumerians actually believed about the nature of existence, the nature of death, and the nature of the beings they called the Anunnaki. Kramer's 1944 book, Sumerian Mythology, later revised and republished, gathered his translations and contextual analysis into a form accessible to general readers. His 1967 paper in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, The Death of Ur-Nammu and His Descent to the Netherworld, brought to light one of the most vivid and procedurally specific accounts of what awaited a king, a human being, in the underworld. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a project of the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford, completed in the early 2000s under the editorial direction of Jeremy Black and Graham Cunningham, among others, assembled the most comprehensive digital resource for Sumerian literary texts in transliteration and translation. It is from this verified corpus, drawing on over a century of scholarship, thousands of tablet fragments, and comparative analysis across multiple museum collections, that the evidence examined in this investigation is drawn. What the tablets say, when read carefully and in context, is not what popular culture imagines. It is stranger, more specific, and more philosophically serious than either the dismissive just mythology reading or the sensationalist ancient aliens interpretation would suggest. The scribes who made these marks in wet clay were working within an intellectual tradition they took seriously, and they were describing something they believed was real, the architecture of what lies below. Before examining what the tablets say happens to human consciousness after death, it is necessary to understand the geography of where that consciousness goes. The Sumerian underworld is not a vague darkness. It is a place. It has gates, corridors, rooms, courts, and a throne. It has a staff. It has a procedure for receiving new arrivals. And it is named, in the Sumerian language, with a precision that deserves attention. The most common Sumerian name for the underworld is Kur, a word which scholar Jeremy Black noted has two distinct meanings. It can mean mountain, specifically the Zagros Mountains to the east of the Mesopotamian plain, or it can mean the earth, the ground itself, and particularly the space beneath the ground. This dual meaning is not simply ambiguity. It reflects a consistent Sumerian cosmological model in which the underworld is understood to lie beneath the surface of the living earth, accessed through an entrance sometimes located in the mountainous east, sometimes understood as a passage straight down through the earth's floor. The underworld was not above, not beyond the horizon, not in the stars. It was below, specifically, physically, geographically below. The underworld is also called Ikala, after its ruler, the name of the place becoming identified with the name of its queen, and Kernugia, a compound Sumerian term meaning, with considerable directness, the land of no return. This last name appears consistently in the texts as what the gatekeeper announces to anyone who approaches: this is the place from which no traveller returns. The qualifier is important, and it will require examination later, because the tablets also describe at least one case in which a return was arranged. But the general rule, the rule that governs the experience of ordinary human consciousness after death, is stated with finality: the land of no return. The physical description of the underworld, drawn across multiple independent texts, is remarkably consistent. The Death of Ur-Nammu, in its Nippur version, Cecil 2441, states directly, "The food of the netherworld is bitter, the water of the netherworld is brackish." This line appears in multiple versions of the text, copied by multiple scribes. The underworld is not a place of punishment in the later Judeo-Christian sense. It is not a hell reserved for the wicked. It is simply unpleasant for everyone. Food that cannot nourish, water that cannot refresh, darkness. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its Akkadian version, adds the sensory detail that would become the most quoted description of the Mesopotamian dead. They are clad like birds, with wings as garments. Scholar Irving Finkel, in his analysis of the Mesopotamian ghost tradition, offered an image that captures this. All the ghosts crowded together in that dark place, swaying shoulder to shoulder, covered in feathered cloaks, dim and dusty. The structure of the underworld is, in its most detailed description, organised around a series of 7 gates. The text of Inanna's Descent, ETCSL 1.4. 1. Composite P468903 provides the most complete account of these gates, and the account is worth reading with care because the 7 gates are not merely a narrative device, they are procedural checkpoints. At each gate, something is taken. When Inanna arrives at the outer boundary of the underworld, she is met by the chief doorman, Neti. His name is specific, his role is administrative, and his first question is practical. Who are you, and why have you come here? The procedure he then follows is prescribed. He goes to his mistress, Ereshkigal, queen of the great below, reports the arrival, and receives instructions. Those instructions are clear. Let the 7 gates of the underworld be bolted. Then let each door of the palace Ganza be opened separately. As for her, after she has entered and crouched down and had her clothes removed, they will be carried away. At the first gate, the turban, headgear for the open country, is taken. At the second gate, the small lapis lazuli beads are removed from the neck. At the third, the twin egg-shaped beads from the breast. At the fourth, the pectoral ornament. At the fifth, the golden ring from the hand. At the sixth, the lapis lazuli measuring rod and measuring line. At the 7th and final gate, the pala dress, the garment of ladyship, is removed from the body. At each removal, Inanna asks, "What is this?" and receives the same response, which translates approximately as "Be satisfied." Inanna, a divine power of the underworld, has been fulfilled. Inanna, you must not open your mouth against the rights of the underworld. The word translated as divine power in this passage is the Sumerian me, the same concept of foundational civilizational knowledge distributed by the gods. The instruction is that Inanna must not speak against the rights. The word used is gar, a term relating to established rule or ordinance. These are not arbitrary acts of humiliation. They are procedural steps in a system governed by established rule, and the rule is named as a manifestation of me. Mainstream scholarship, represented by Kramer's foundational work and subsequent analyses by scholars including Thorkild Jacobson, Wolfram von Soden, and the editorial team of the Electronic Text Corpus, reads this stripping sequence primarily as a literary device illustrating Inanna's progressive loss of power and divine status as she enters a realm governed by different principles than the upper world. In this reading, the gates symbolize the boundary between divine and mortal, or between living authority and the equalizing stillness of death. This interpretation accounts for a great deal of the text, but it sits alongside a detail that the conventional reading does not fully address. Each item removed is specifically named and specifically associated with a me. The turban is associated with one of the powers of divine office. The measuring rod and measuring line are instruments of cosmic order. They appear in the creation hymns as tools used by the gods to lay out the boundaries of civilization itself. The polar dress is specifically identified as the garment of ladyship, a status marker with cosmic significance. If these were merely items of clothing and jewellery, the text would not need to identify each one as a fulfilled divine power. The specificity suggests something more than a metaphor for loss of status. What if the 7 gates map something about consciousness itself? What if each removal describes the progressive dissolution of a particular layer of self, the social identity, the relational markers, the signs of cosmic authority, the measuring capacities, and finally, the outermost garment of embodied existence? Under this reading, what arrives in the underworld, stripped of all 7 layers, is not a diminished version of Inanna. It is a reduced or core form of her, the consciousness that persists when every external marker has been taken away. This reading is speculative, and it should be held as such, but it is a reading that the procedural specificity of the text invites, particularly when held alongside what the other tablets describe about the nature of the soul that survives. After passing the 7th gate, the text states the Anunnaki, the 7 judges, rendered their decision against her. They looked at her, it was the look of death. They spoke to her, it was the speech of anger. They shouted at her, it was the shout of heavy guilt. The afflicted woman was turned into a corpse, and the corpse was hung on a hook. These are the Anunnaki, named here not as creators, not as sky gods, but as the 7 judges whose gaze is in itself a verdict, the name that survived death, Giddim and Iammu. The Sumerian scribes had a specific term for what survived the death of a human being. They called it the Giddim. In Akkadian, the language that eventually absorbed and replaced Sumerian as the spoken tongue of Mesopotamia, the equivalent word was Iammu. Understanding these terms, what they include, what they exclude, what their linguistic context implies, is essential to understanding what the tablets say about post-death consciousness, because the Giddim Emu is described in the texts with considerable precision. The Giddim was not the body was buried, provided with grave goods, mourned through specific rituals. The Giddim was the aspect of a person that departed from the body at death and travelled to the underworld. Scholar Jeremy Black, in his work on Mesopotamian Religion Co., authored with Anthony Green, described the Giddim as encompassing what in modern English we might approach as the combination of personality, intelligence, memory, and emotional continuity, the things that made a person recognisably themselves. Irving Finkel, in his public discussions of the British Museum's ghost-related collections, put it more directly, the Giddim was fully self-aware. It retained its identity. It remembered who it had been. It could be angry, grieving, affectionate, or demanding, depending on the circumstances of its death and the treatment it received from the living. The bilingual Sumerian Akkadian incantation tablet held in the British Museum under Museum number K318 is one of the most important documents for understanding the Emu in practical terms. It is a Neo-Assyrian composition, but the spells it contains draw on a tradition extending back into the Sumerian period, and its taxonomy of ghost types is detailed enough to constitute what might be recognised in modern terms as a classification system. The tablet lists various categories of EMU requiring different ritual responses. The ghost of someone who died by fire, whose smoke went upward, and whose spirit is therefore unlocatable. The ghost of someone who drowned, unburied. The ghost of someone killed in battle. The ghost of someone who died in childbirth. The ghost of someone who died cursed by a parent. The ghost of someone whose family failed to maintain the rituals of remembrance. Each category is distinct. Each requires a different approach. The scholar of ancient Mesopotamian religion, Joanne Scurlock, whose work on death and the afterlife in ancient Mesopotamia remains one of the most thorough recent analyses of the primary sources, has noted that the Emu concept implies a double-layered understanding of what the human being is. In Mesopotamian thought, the body was animated not only by the Emu, but also by what the Akkadian texts call Napitu, a term often translated as breath or life force, related to the activity of breathing, which departed from the body in a different way at death. The Napatu was something like the vital animating force, the Emu was something more like the personality, the continuous self, the thing that persisted in the underworld. The two were not the same, and the texts are careful not to conflate them. This distinction matters because it suggests the Sumerians were working within a fairly sophisticated model of what a human being actually is. The body is not the self. The vital force that animates the body is not the self either, or not the complete self. The self, the continuous, aware, remembering, feeling thing that makes you recognisably you, is the Gidimuyumu, and it is this that descends to Ikala. The tablet K3119 also provides evidence for what happened to Yumu that were improperly managed. Finkel has described these as ghosts in the fullest sense, spirits that return to the living world, not because they were permitted to do so by the gods, but because something had gone wrong. The reasons are specified: improper burial, a failure of family remembrance, death by violence with no proper mourning, a curse from a parent that had broken the fundamental tie between the living and the dead. An emu in any of these conditions could enter a living person through the ear. The texts are specific about the entry point and cause illness, confusion, bad luck, and in severe cases, death. The solution, as described in the same body of texts, was the work of the Ipu, a specialist healer priest whose role was specifically to address the supernatural dimension of illness. The Ipu would diagnose which category of emu was causing the problem, recite the appropriate spell from the classification system, and either send the spirit back to the underworld or, in cases where identification was unclear, recite the comprehensive list of ghost types with the formula. Whether you are this type of ghost or that type of ghost, we know who you are. Go back where you belong. Identification, as Finkel observed, was itself a means of power over the ghost. This is a detail that rewards careful attention. The Sumerian and Babylonian understanding of the emu was not that it was mindless or automatic. It was self-aware, but it was also responsive to naming, to ritual, and to social acknowledgement. An emu that was properly mourned, regularly provided with food and water through the Kispum ritual, and remembered by name, remained settled in the underworld. An emu that was forgotten or improperly treated became restless and potentially dangerous. The relationship between the living and the dead in Mesopotamian understanding was not terminated by death. It was transformed into a different kind of obligation. The word Giddim, in its earliest Sumerian forms, carries the combined sense of ghost and something closer to divine aspect of the person. This phrasing, the divine aspect, is significant. If the Giddim is the divine aspect of the self, then the Sumerian model implies that what survives death is not the social, embodied, or instrumental self, but something that was understood to have a different origin. The Sumerian creation texts describe human beings as made from clay mixed with the blood of a god, specifically in some versions with the blood of a slain Anunnaki deity. The Giddim, the surviving consciousness, was the portion of the human being that carried this divine derivation. What went to the underworld was not simply a person, it was a fragment of something that had originally been divine. This framing, if taken at anything close to face value, changes the nature of the question entirely. The tablets do not ask only what happens to the dead, they ask what happens to a portion of divine substance that has been temporarily housed in a human body. The 7 gates and what was taken. Return to the gates. Return to the threshold. There is a particular quality of attention that the 7-gate sequence in Inanna's descent rewards. Read quickly, it appears to be a straightforward narrative of progressive humiliation, a powerful goddess reduced to nothing at the entrance to a hostile realm. Read slowly, with the other texts held alongside it, it begins to reveal a structure that is harder to account for as accidental. The 7 items removed from Inanna at the 7 gates are worth listing again and holding individually. The turban, headgear for the open country. the small lapis lazuli beads around the neck, the twin egg-shaped beads at the breast, the pectoral ornament named Kom, man come, the golden ring at the hand, the lapis lazuli, measuring rod and measuring line, and finally the pala dress, the garment of ladyship covering the body. Each removal is described with an identical response. A divine power of the underworld has been fulfilled. The Sumerian phrase is Mi Kigola Baigar in transliteration. A divine power of the great earth has been established. Not taken away from Inanna, technically, but established, actualized. The underworld does not simply take these things. It completes something in taking them. The Akkadian parallel text, The Descent of Ishtar, held in British Museum Neo-Assyrian tablets, the later version of the same myth, adds a detail that the Sumerian original does not include. When Ishtar, the Akkadian name for Inanna, descends and is stripped at the gates, the text notes that as each attribute is removed, the corresponding aspect of its function ceases in the world above. When the ornament of sight is removed, seeing ceases. When the ornament of hearing is removed, hearing ceases. The stripping of Ishtar is not just personal, it reverberates cosmically. Whether this detail was present in the original Sumerian conception, or whether it is an Akkadian elaboration, is a question scholars continue to debate. But it points toward a reading of the gates that is at least worth exploring. The 7 gates may map a structure of layers in which the self or consciousness is organized, such that the removal of each attribute at each gate corresponds to the dissolution of a distinct mode of awareness or being. If the turban, the headgear for the open country, associated with Inanna's office of En, a term combining concepts of lordship and priestly function, represents a mode of consciousness related to social religious authority and cosmic orientation, its removal at the first gate could mark the dissolution of identity as office. The lapis lazuli beads at the neck, a near-universal symbol across ancient Near Eastern cultures of divine protection and cosmic connection, may mark something about relational consciousness, the self as connected to others. The twin egg-shaped beads at the breast, associated in Sumerian iconography with fertility and generative potential, may map to something about the creative or generative capacity of the consciousness. The pectoral, with its inscription Come, man come, an explicitly relational attractive power, its removal may mark the dissolution of the self's capacity for desire and drawing. The golden ring at the hand, an instrument of binding and authority, possibly the dissolution of executive function or will. The measuring rod and line, tools of cosmic order, the instruments used by the gods to lay out the structure of reality itself. At the 6th gate, the dissolution of the capacity to measure and order, to perceive structure. And finally, the pala dress, the outermost garment of identity, the social skin of the self, stripped at the 7th gate, leaving what the text simply calls her. What arrived before the 7 judges of the underworld was Inanna reduced to her absolute minimum. The text says she was turned into a corpse and hung on a hook. The conventional reading is that she died fully in the underworld and had to be revived to return. But the word used for what is hung on the hook deserves attention. It is the Sumerian word Adamu, sometimes translated as corpse, but also carrying the sense of flesh image or matter form. What was hung on the hook was the material form. The Giddim, the divine aspect, the conscious persisting self, is, by definition in Sumerian cosmology, that which cannot be hung on a hook in this sense. It continues. The Akkadian parallel text of The Descent of Ishtar adds a line that the Oxford translation renders: since Ishtar has gone down to the land of no return, the bull does not mount the cow, the donkey does not approach the female donkey. All procreative activity in the world above ceases, while Ishtar is below. This detail has been analysed primarily as a mythological explanation of seasonal dormancy, winter as the absence of the fertility goddess. The seasonal reading is credible and well supported in scholarship. But it sits alongside the possibility that the descent is also simultaneously a technical description of the passage of a divine consciousness through a series of transformative thresholds, and that the seasonal reading and the metaphysical reading were not, for the Sumerians, mutually exclusive. One of the consistent features of Sumerian intellectual culture, observable across many texts, is what might be called the principle of simultaneous truth. The Sumerians did not appear to experience the same compulsion towards singular interpretation that characterizes much of later Western intellectual tradition. A text could describe the origin of floods as both the activity of the storm god Ikur and the consequence of divine displeasure with human noise. A myth could simultaneously be a story about a goddess, an agricultural calendar, and a cosmological statement about the nature of consciousness. The texts were composed with layers intended to be read at multiple registers simultaneously. The 7 gates are, at minimum, a narrative structure. They may also be, and the precision of the Me language suggests they may have been designed to be, a record of something else. What Enkidu saw, the Ghost's Report. Of all the texts that touch on what happens after death in the Sumerian corpus, the one that reads most like a direct first-person account is the closing section of the composition Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, TCSL 1.8.1.4, whose principal tablet fragments include CBS 9869, CBS 13121, and CBS 13459 in the Penn Museum, all from the Nippur excavations of the Babylonian expedition. This text, assembled from multiple fragments in multiple museum collections, provides something that almost no other ancient text offers: a ghost's direct testimony about the conditions of the dead, organised in a systematic survey that reads less like poetry and more like a classified report. The narrative setup is this: Enkidu, servant and companion of the legendary king Gilgamesh, descends to the underworld to retrieve objects that Gilgamesh has lost. His elag and echidna, wooden instruments whose exact nature remains disputed among scholars, but which were clearly of personal value and perhaps ritual. Significance: Gilgamesh warns Enkidu at length about the behavioural rules of the underworld. Do not put on clean garments, the dead will recognise you as alien. Do not anoint yourself with fine oil, the dead will smell the life in you and surround you. Do not carry weapons. Do not kiss your wife or your child when you see them there. Enkidu disregards these instructions entirely and violates every one of them. As a result, the underworld detains him. Gilgamesh then does what he did in the parallel narrative of Inanna's descent. He goes first to Enlil, then to Nanna, then to Enki, seeking rescue. Enlil and Nanna refuse. Enki intervenes. He petitions Utu, the sun god, to open a hole in the earth through which Enkidu's spirit may be brought up. The text says Utu opened the hole and brought up his servant with his breeze from the netherworld. The Giddim of Enkidu rises and the two friends embrace. What follows is the systematic survey. Gilgamesh asks, "Did you see him who had one son?" The answer describes that man's condition. 2 sons? 3 sons? The survey continues through 7 sons, then moves to other categories: the palace eunuch, the woman who never gave birth, the young man who never slept with his wife, the young woman who never slept with her husband, the man who had no heir, the leper, the man who fell in battle, the spirit with no funerary offerings, the drowned man, the man who died by fire. The pattern that emerges from this survey is the most detailed description of tiered afterlife conditions in any Sumerian text, and its organising principle is both sociological and procedural. The condition of the Giddim in the underworld depends on 2 primary factors: the number of living descendants who maintain memorial offerings, and the circumstances of death and burial. The hierarchy of the living descendants tier runs from comfort to misery. The man with 7 sons sits on a throne as a companion of the gods and listens to judgments. He occupies the highest position available to ordinary human consciousness in the underworld. The man with 6 sons is as cheerful as a ploughman. The man with 5 sons enters the palace easily, like a competent scribe. The man with 4 sons has his heart rejoice. The man with 3 sons drinks water better than nothing. The man with 2 sons sits on a couple of bricks, eating bread. The man with 1 son weeps bitterly at a wooden peg driven into his wall. The principle here is unmistakable. The quality of post-death consciousness is not fixed by moral judgment at the moment of death. It fluctuates according to the ongoing behaviour of the living. A man with 7 sons who actively maintain the kispum, the regular food and water offerings for the dead, sits with the gods. A man with 1 son who neglects those duties exists in misery. The consciousness survives. Its condition is a function of the relationship between the dead and the living. The category of the spirit, with no funerary offerings, describes the worst available condition. He eats the scraps and crumbs tossed out in the street. This spirit has no one, no offerings, no remembrance, no relationship with the living. It subsists on what is discarded by others. It is, in the terms of the Sumerian social order, the equivalent of the homeless and dispossessed, not actively tortured, but outside the structure of provision entirely. By contrast, and this detail appears across multiple versions of the text, the stillborn children who never received a name fare surprisingly well. They play at a table of gold and silver, laden with honey and ghee. The interpretation of this detail has generated scholarly discussion. Thorkel Jacobson, in his analysis of Mesopotamian religion, suggested it reflected a compassionate theological impulse. Those who never had the opportunity to incur moral debt are held harmless. Others have noted that stillborn children were also not burdened by any relational obligations. Their Giddim had no social network, no descendants, no obligations on either side, and existed in a kind of neutral freedom. The man who died by fire is absent from the survey. Enkidu says, "I did not see him. His spirit is not about. His smoke went up to the sky." This is one of the most intriguing lines in the entire corpus. Fire is the one mode of death that the survey cannot account for, because fire apparently does not deliver the emu to the underworld. The smoke goes upward. Where it goes, whether to an upper realm, whether it simply disperses, the text does not say. The absence of an answer is itself an answer. There is something the system does not fully accommodate. The man who fell in battle has no one to hold his head. His father and mother are not there. His wife weeps. The text does not say his condition is unbearable, but the emphasis on the absence of human presence and comfort is clear. The social dimension of death, the networks of care and remembrance that make existence in the underworld bearable, cannot follow a warrior who fell in an alien field. The man whose Giddim is cursed by his own parents roams without an heir. His spirit has no anchor. He is untethered in the underworld, which the text implies is a form of suffering. The man who had no respect for the words of his father and mother never ceases to cry, "O my body, O my limbs." The embodied memory of neglected relationship persists as physical sensation even after the body is gone. What the survey as a whole describes is a post-death consciousness that is fully continuous with the moral and social dimensions of the life that preceded it. The Giddim retains memory, emotional experience, sensation, and social positioning. It does not start over. It does not escape the relationships it had built or neglected. It carries the entire weight of a life into the underworld and continues, in a reduced and dimmer form, to be that life. Mainstream scholarship, following Jacobson and Kramer, reads this primarily as a social function document, a religious text designed to reinforce the importance of family obligations, funerary rites, and ancestor maintenance in Mesopotamian society. This reading is well supported and analytically sound. but it leaves open the question that the text itself insists upon. The description of afterlife conditions given by Enkidu's ghost is presented not as a moral allegory, but as a first-hand report. Enkidu was there. He saw these people. He described what he observed. The framing is that of testimony, not parable. Whether that framing should be taken at face value is a question the reader must answer for themselves. What is not in question is the sophistication and internal consistency of the system being described. The Anunnaki as judges, authority over the dead. They are named in the text with a specificity that is easy to overlook if you read quickly. In the Inanna's descent account, after she passes all 7 gates, she enters the throne room of the underworld and faces the judges. The text in the electronic text corpus, drawing on its 50-plus cuneiform fragments, records the Anunna, the 7 judges, rendered their decision against her. The Sumerian word translated here is Anunna, the older form of the term that appears in later texts as Anunnaki, literally the Sumerian and Kir combined, though the precise etymological breakdown is a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. In the earliest texts from the period of Gudea of Lagash, around 2144 to 2124 BC, the Anunnaki designates the most powerful divine beings in the Sumerian pantheon, the descendants of An, the sky god, who as a group constitute the governing council of cosmic order. In the specific context of the underworld, as both the Inanna's descent text and the Death of Enuma text make explicit, the Anunnaki are not this full cosmic council. They are a subset of 7 who permanently reside in Ekala and exercise the judicial function of the dead. The Aurak database, maintained by the University of Pennsylvania in its Ancient Mesopotamian Gods and Goddesses resource, makes a distinction that is crucial for this investigation. The term Anunnaki, at different points in the Sumerian textual tradition, carries different specific meanings. In creation hymns, it can refer to the children of An as a collectivity. In administrative texts from the year 3 period, approximately 2112 to 2004 BC CE, it often refers to the major civic gods. But in the context of the underworld, in the death texts, the descent myths, the ghost literature, it consistently and specifically designates the 7 judges. The gaze of these judges, according to the text, is in itself a transformative force. They looked at her, it was the look of death. They spoke to her, it was the speech of anger. They shouted at her, it was the shout of heavy guilt. The authority of this look is not merely symbolic. In Sumerian theology, the gaze of the divine was understood to be ontologically effective. The god's attention could create, sustain, or destroy what it rested on. The Anunnaki judges do not simply evaluate and pronounce. Their evaluation changes the state of what they evaluate. Inanna, who arrived at the throne room still possessed of divine identity, becomes a corpse under their gaze. The Death of Enuma text, TCSL 2.4.1.1, reconstructed by Kramer from Nippur fragments and subsequently refined by scholars including Thorkild Jacobson and more recently Miguel Civil, provides a complementary view of the Anunnaki's role in the underworld that fills in details that the Inanna text does not cover. In this composition, when Enuma arrives in the underworld after his death in battle, he presents gifts to the underworld rulers, to Nergal, to Gilgamesh in his capacity as king of the netherworld, to Ereshkigal, to Dumuzi, to Namtar, who decrees all fates, to Ninjik-Zida. The list of rulers receiving gifts is itself a map of the underworld's administrative hierarchy. After the gift-giving, after the procedural integration of the new arrival into the underworld's social order, the text states, at the command of Ereshkigal, all the soldiers who had been killed by weapons and all the men who had been found guilty were given into the king's hands. Enuma was, with Gilgamesh, his beloved brother, he will issue the judgments of the netherworld and render the decisions of the netherworld. This is a remarkable passage. Ur-Namma, the king who in life had issued the Code of Ur-Namma, the oldest surviving law code in the world, is granted in the underworld a continuation of his judicial function. He will help Gilgamesh in the work of issuing the judgments of the netherworld. The underworld is not merely a place of passive existence. It has ongoing administration. The dead do not simply dwell. Some of them work. The nature of this underworld judicial work is specified. Ur-Nammu and Gilgamesh issue judgments over two specific populations, those killed by weapons and those found guilty of unspecified offences. The language of found guilty implies a process of evaluation that precedes the assignment of Ur-Nammu's jurisdiction. The guilty have already been judged. Ur-Nammu and Gilgamesh manage the consequences of that judgment. Somewhere earlier in the process, likely at the moment of the Anunnaki's gaze, the determination was already made. The figure of Namtar deserves specific attention. In the Death of Ur-Nammu text, Ur-Nammu presents gifts to Namtar, who decrees all the fates in his palace. Namtar is Ereshkigal's Sukkal, her divine attendant and minister. The Akkadian materials describing Namtar characterize him as the divine agent of individual destiny at death. It is Namtar who carries out the decree of death on the individual, who seizes the specific person at the specific moment their allotted time expires. In the Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld text, when Enkidu is detained by the underworld, Gilgamesh's lament specifically lists the agents who did not seize him. Namtar is first on the list. Namtar did not seize him. The Asag did not seize him, but the netherworld has seized him. Namtar is the named agent of individual death. The netherworld itself, as a collective force, was what detained Enkidu, suggesting that some detentions were outside even Namtar's specific jurisdiction. Nergal, named in the Death of Ur-Nammu as the Enlil of the netherworld, the highest administrative authority of the underworld, mirroring Enlil's role in the upper world, occupies a complex position. The Amarna version of the Nergal and Ereshkigal myth, preserved in British Museum Tablet 1888, 101369, catalogued as E357, and referenced in the CDLI database under artifact number P270856, describes how Nergal came to co-rule the underworld alongside Ereshkigal. This tablet was discovered at Amarna in Egypt, the capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten, written in Cuneiform as part of the Diplomatic Correspondence Archive, which itself speaks to how widely the Mesopotamian cosmological tradition was known and studied in the ancient world. The Nergal and Ereshkigal myth describes the political arrangement of the underworld's governance. Nergal holds the power of war, plague and violent death. Ereshkigal holds the sovereign authority over the dead as a whole. Together they constitute the governing pair of a realm that is not chaotic but administered. The Sultan Tepe version of the same myth, discovered at the site of Huzerina in southeastern Turkey and dated to the Neo-Assyrian period, provides additional detail about the hierarchy of the underworld. The 14 gatekeepers of the Sultan Tepe version, an expanded number compared to the 7 of Inanna's descent, reflect the administrative elaboration of the tradition over centuries, but the core principle remains consistent. The underworld is a place of governance. The Giddim does not simply fall into a void. It enters a structured realm with authorities, procedures and laws. The Anunnaki as judges, in this light, are not arbitrary executioners. They are a judicial panel operating within a defined legal framework. The Me of the underworld, the divine powers of the great earth, whose decisions are binding in the way that the decisions of a court within its jurisdiction are binding. The look of death is not cruelty, it is procedure. And procedure, the texts consistently imply, has the character of preservation as much as restriction. The ordered underworld is preferable to the alternative, which is the chaos that would result from the dead and living occupying the same space without regulation. The unburied and the forgotten conditions of the soul. A full understanding of what the Sumerian tablets say happens to consciousness after death requires a close examination of the relationship between the living and the dead, specifically the system of obligations that the tablets describe as governing the condition of the Giddim in Irkalla. This system is not incidental to the cosmological picture, it is structural. The post-death state of human consciousness was not, in Sumerian understanding, determined exclusively at the moment of death and fixed permanently thereafter. It was ongoing, relational, and dependent on maintenance. The Mesopotamian ritual, known as the Kispum Mian Kisigar, the purification of the earth place, is the practical expression of this obligation. The Kispum was performed monthly at the new moon and also at a specific annual observance during the month of Abu. Its essential components were the preparation of food and the pouring of water or beer for the dead ancestor. The family would typically gather at the place of burial. In the Mesopotamian urban context, the dead were frequently buried under the house or in the household courtyard, and the eldest son would make the offerings, pronounce the name of the dead person, and invite the Giddim to eat and drink. The name-pronouncing element is specified in multiple texts as essential. The dead must be named. An unnamed or forgotten Giddim is, in the system's terms, truly dead in a way that a remembered one is not. The Mari Archive, a collection of old Babylonian tablets from the city of Mari on the Middle Euphrates, dated to approximately 1800 to 1750 BC, contains administrative texts that describe Kispum provisions, the allocation of food, beer, and other offerings from temple stores for the maintenance of royal dead. This is not a marginal popular practice. It was institutionalized at the level of royal administration, budgeted, recorded on clay, and considered as essential a function of governance as the distribution of grain. The dead were not left to whatever came after. They were provisioned, maintained, and included in the ongoing social economy. The theological basis for this practice, as described in the ghost literature, is straightforward. The Giddim in Irkalla requires sustenance. The underworld's food is bitter and its water brackish. The Kispum offerings, sent, in the Mesopotamian understanding, through the earth to the realm below, supplemented the unpleasant provisions of the underworld itself. A well-maintained Giddim had better food and water than the default supply. A neglected Giddim had only what the underworld provided, which, as the texts repeatedly specify, was inadequate by design. This design element is worth noting. The underworld's inadequate provisions were not a punishment. They were structural. The architecture of Irkalla, the dark, the dust, the bitter food, the brackish water, existed to ensure that the dead required the living, and that the living therefore maintained the relationships that structured society. Scholar Jeremy Black, in his analysis of Mesopotamian social structure, noted that the Kispum obligations were a powerful social cohesive force. They anchored families to their dead, to the places of their dead, and to each other in the ongoing maintenance of those obligations. The underworld's unpleasantness was, from this perspective, a social engineering device. Whether it was engineered by the gods or by the scribes who wrote the texts is again a question the tablets leave open. The royal tombs of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, provide the most vivid archaeological evidence of how seriously the Sumerian elite took the provisioning of the dead. The tombs, dated to approximately 2600 to 2500 BC and currently represented in collections at the British Museum and the Penn Museum, contained not only spectacular jewellery, musical instruments, and vessels of gold and silver, but in some cases the bodies of dozens of retainers, servants, musicians, soldiers, and ladies in waiting who appear to have voluntarily accompanied their royal masters into death. The royal tomb of Queen Pwabi Museum, catalogue B16742, among other objects, included her body on a bier, a magnificent headdress of gold, lapis lazuli and carnelian, and the remains of what Woolley interpreted as a court gathered in the antechamber, all in full ceremonial dress apparently, having taken a sedative or poison before the tomb was sealed. The mainstream interpretation of the Ur death pits, as they are sometimes called, is that they represent the most extreme expression of the obligation to provision the dead, that those who served a ruler in life followed them into the underworld to continue that service. This interpretation is not without alternative readings. Some scholars have proposed the retainers were not volunteers but sacrificed, and the evidence is ambiguous enough that certainty is impossible. What is unambiguous is the scale of the investment. The living were prepared to commit extraordinary resources, human, material, and organisational, to the project of ensuring that the Giddim of the royal dead arrived in Ilkala with an appropriate retinue. The death of Ur-Namma text describes Ur-Namma himself bringing gifts to the gods of the underworld when he arrives. An elaborate inventory of weapons, precious vessels, royal garments, and administrative tools given to Nergal, Gilgamesh, Ereshkigal, Dumuzi, Namtar, and others. The king arrives not as a supplicant, but as a donor, equipped with gifts that establish his status in the new realm. His donkeys were buried with him. The text explicitly states this, noting that his donkeys were to be found with the king. They were buried with him. The grave goods at Ur were not merely symbolic. They were, in Sumerian theological understanding, the actual provisions that would accompany the Giddim into the world below. The condition of a Giddim that received none of this, the ghost with no funerary offerings, whom Enkidu saw eating scraps from the street, was the most desolate outcome the system permitted short of fire death. It was not a moral judgment. It was not punishment for wrongdoing. It was simply the consequence of being unremembered. In a cosmological system where the quality of the afterlife depends directly on the ongoing care of the living, to have no living descendants who remember you is to exist without provision. The social structure of consciousness, the web of relationships that defines a person in life, extends into death and determines the quality of what comes after. This understanding has a corollary that the texts make explicit in scattered passages. The most blessed of the dead, as the ghost literature emphasizes, were those who died with the greatest number of children, because children would maintain the obligations longest and most reliably. The eldest son held the primary duty. When he died, his eldest son inherited it. The chain of remembrance was, in theory, a generational chain that could extend indefinitely into the future. Each link an act of pouring water, speaking a name, placing bread near the place of the dead. What this implies, if the cosmological model is taken seriously as a description of something real, is that human consciousness after death was understood to be sustained not by divine grace, but by human effort. The gods maintained the architecture of the underworld. The Anunnaki administered its judgments. But the quality of existence within that architecture was a social responsibility distributed across the generations of the living. Death, in Sumerian theology, was not the end of a person's participation in the social order. It was the beginning of their dependence on it. The god who returned, Inanna's resurrection pattern. Inanna did not stay dead. This is the detail in the descent text that most resists the conventional interpretive framework, and it is the detail that opens onto the most difficult questions the tablets raise about the nature of the consciousness they are describing. The story, as the Atisil translation establishes from its 50+ source fragments, proceeds as follows. Inanna descends. She is stripped at the 7 gates. She is judged by the Anunnaki. She is turned into a corpse and hung on a hook. 3 days pass, a duration specified in the Nippur version with the phrase, after 3 days and 3 nights. Her faithful minister Ninkubura, following pre-arranged instructions, goes to Enlil, then to Nanna, pleading for Inanna's release. Both refuse. Both give the same response. The divine powers of the underworld are not to be craved. Whoever gets to that place must remain there. Then Enki intervenes. Enki creates 2 small beings from the dirt under his fingernails, the Kuljara and the Galatura, sexless or liminal figures who can flit past the door like flies, slip through the door pivots like phantoms. He gives one the life-giving plant, the other the life-giving water. He sends them down with specific instructions, find Eresh Gigol, who will be in distress, moaning, "O my heart, O my liver." Mirror her pain back to her with sympathy. When she offers rewards, refuse the river of water, refuse the field of grain. Ask only for the corpse hanging on the hook. Sprinkle it with the life-giving plant and the life-giving water. Let Inanna arise. The Golatura and Korjara do exactly this. The corpse is sprinkled, Inanna arises. But the Anunnaki, the text says, sees her as she attempts to leave. Who has ever ascended from the underworld has ascended unscathed from the underworld. If Inanna is to ascend from the underworld, let her provide a substitute for herself. The law of the substitute. The underworld's population cannot be depleted by a departure without compensation. If a consciousness leaves, another must take its place. The balance is maintained not by moral criteria. The substitute need not be equivalent in goodness or worth to the one released, but by the structural requirement that the total count remain whole. Inanna ascends. Dumuzi, her husband, who had sat comfortably on a throne while Inanna was dead, is taken in her place. He descends. Eventually, in a resolution negotiated by Inanna and mediated by the sun god Utu, Dumuzi and his sister Geshtinanna agree to each spend half the year in the underworld, rotating between the realms in a cycle that the text explicitly links to the seasons. The resurrection pattern here, descent, death, revival by specific substances, ascent through substitution, cyclical return, is the element of the Inanna texts that has generated the most scholarly discussion about origins. Researchers including Thorkild Jacobson and later Diane Walkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer, in their collaborative 1983 study Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, analysed the pattern in terms of its relationship to seasonal agriculture. Inanna below equals the dormant season, Inanna above equals the growing season, Dumuzi below equals the death of the vegetation, Dumuzi above equals the flourishing. The agricultural seasonal reading is coherent, well supported, and represents the mainstream scholarly interpretation. But the precision of the mechanisms involved, the specific agents Enki creates, the specific substances they carry, the specific exchange negotiated at the gates, resists reduction to simple allegory. Agricultural metaphors do not generally require named entities with defined roles, specific procedural instructions, and a legal principle governing their operation. The law of the substitute, in particular, is a juridical formulation. It has the character of an established rule within the underworld's governance, not a narrative convenience. Some researchers in the tradition of comparative mythology have noted that the Inanna resurrection pattern shares structural elements with accounts of death and return found in traditions widely separated in time and geography. The Egyptian myth of Osiris, the later Greek story of Persephone, the Orphic accounts of descent and initiation, and eventually the Christian narrative of resurrection. Whether these parallels reflect independent parallel development, cultural transmission across ancient trade routes, or something more fundamental about the structure of human consciousness and its attempt to articulate the death-rebirth pattern, is a question this investigation cannot answer. What it can observe is that the Sumerian account is, by archaeological reckoning, the earliest fully articulated written version of this pattern that has survived. The Dumuzi-Geshtinanna cycle, the half-and-half arrangement that resolves the descent narrative, introduces a further element that the texts do not fully explain but clearly imply: the possibility of managed cyclical movement between the worlds. Dumuzi goes down for half the year and comes up for half the year. His sister performs the same movement in reverse. The consciousness does not permanently depart. It circulates. The tablets do not develop this into a formal doctrine of reincarnation. That concept, as the next chapter will examine, is conspicuously absent from the Sumerian corpus. But the cyclical return of Dumuzi, rotating across the threshold twice each year, raises a possibility that the texts neither confirm nor deny that the movement between the realms of the living and the dead was not, in Sumerian cosmological understanding, entirely one-directional. The life-giving plant and the life-giving water used by Enki's creations to revive Inanna are not metaphors, they are objects. They exist within the cosmological geography of the texts as real substances with specific properties. The me of the underworld could be fulfilled, the stripping completed, the death accomplished, and then reversed through application of specific agents held by specific knowledge. Enki, whose house at Eridu is described as the repository of the me, is the only one of the great gods who intervenes, because he is the only one who possesses the knowledge and the will to apply it. Father Enki, Inanna's instructions to Ninkabura, had specified the Lord of Great Wisdom knows about the life-giving plant and the life-giving water. He is the one who will restore me to life. The restoration was technical, not miraculous. It required the right substances, applied by the right agents, following the right procedure. This framing, in which the reversal of death is a matter of knowledge and method rather than divine whim, is entirely consistent with a broader Sumerian understanding of the me as a body of technical knowledge that could be transmitted, preserved, and applied. The question of what it means, what it implies about the nature of consciousness and the structure of death, is the question the tablets press toward without fully answering. The oldest question, did Mesopotamia know reincarnation? This is the chapter that requires the most care, because it is the chapter most susceptible to the two opposite errors, claiming too much on the basis of thin evidence, or dismissing as impossible something the evidence actually leaves open. The question of whether Sumerian and Mesopotamian thought included any concept equivalent to reincarnation, the return of an individual consciousness to a new body, must be approached through what the texts actually say, and equally importantly, through what they do not. The direct answer is, no Sumerian or Babylonian text has been recovered that explicitly describes the return of a dead person's giddim to a new human body. The concept of reincarnation as a formally stated doctrine, the idea that the individual soul undergoes repeated embodiment in successive physical lives, does not appear in the Cuneiform record in the way that it appears, for example, in the Upanishads, the Orphic gold tablets, or later, Pythagorean texts. The absence is significant. The Sumerian corpus is large enough, and the subject of death is treated in it extensively enough, that if reincarnation were a central doctrine, we would expect to find it explicitly stated somewhere. We do not. What we do find is more ambiguous, and the ambiguity deserves honest examination. The first relevant element is the Dumuzi-Geshtinanna cycle discussed in the previous chapter. The half-year rotation of Dumuzi between the upper world and the underworld is explicitly a cyclical return from death to life. It does not involve a new body. Dumuzi returns as Dumuzi, but it does establish the principle within Sumerian cosmological thought that the boundary between the living world and the dead one was not absolutely impermeable under all conditions. Managed returns were possible. They were exceptional, they required divine authorization, and they involved specific substitution mechanics, but they were possible. The second element is a passage in the Death of Gilgamesh text, Ritual 1.8.1.3, which describes Gilgamesh's fate after his own death. The text, fragmentary and difficult to reconstruct fully, includes the line, "Let Gilgamesh as a ghost, below among the dead, be the governor of the netherworld. Let him be preeminent among the ghosts." This is the same afterlife governance role that the Death of Ur-Namma text assigns to Ur-Namma. He joins Gilgamesh in issuing the judgments of the netherworld. What is notable here is that Gilgamesh's position as governor of the underworld is established by divine decree. Let Gilgamesh as a ghost is the language of a divine decision. His post-death role is assigned, not earned through moral calculation. The Anunnaki and the greater gods jointly determine what a Giddim of sufficient distinction does in the underworld. The third element is the creation mythology. Multiple Sumerian and Babylonian texts describe the creation of humanity as involving the mixing of divine substance, the blood of a slain god, or divine breath, with clay. The Atrahasis epic, which survives in Akkadian but draws on Sumerian antecedents, describes how the god Ilawela was slain and his flesh and blood mixed with clay to create the first humans. The divine element in humanity, the element that makes human consciousness qualitatively different from mere clay, is not created fresh at each human birth. It is, in this model, reinstantiated. Each human being receives a portion of a divine substance that pre-existed them and will, in the form of the Giddim, outlast them. If this divine substance pre-existed the individual and continues after the individual's death, the question of what happens to it in the longer arc of cosmic time, beyond the individual afterlife in Irkalla, is one that the texts raise but do not resolve. The underworld in Sumerian cosmology is not eternal. The cosmic order that establishes it is periodically subject to disruption. The flood narrative of Ziusudra, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, preserved in a tablet now in the University Museum in Philadelphia, CBS 10673, describes a cataclysmic disruption of the established order, followed by its restoration. The restoration reinstates kingship, the cult of the gods, and by implication the me of civilization, including the me of the underworld and the knowledge of what happens after death. If the cosmic order can be disrupted and restored, and if the Giddim is the divine element in the human being, the question of what happens to the Giddim during a cosmic disruption is one the tablets gesture toward without answering. The scholars of Mesopotamian religion who have addressed the reincarnation question most directly, including Skurlock, Botro, and more recently Andrew George, in his work on the Epic of Gilgamesh, have generally concluded that the Mesopotamian tradition did not include formal reincarnation doctrine. Jean Botro, in his landmark study of Mesopotamian religion and its relationship to rationalism, argued that the Mesopotamian conception of death was characterized by a profound resignation. The gods kept mortality as the fundamental condition of human existence, reserving immortality for themselves, and that this resignation precluded the consolation of a returning cycle. The Gilgamesh epic's most explicit statement on death, coming from the tavern keeper Siduri in the Old Babylonian version, is stark. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but life they retained in their own keeping. There is no suggestion that this allotment is temporary or cyclical for ordinary human beings. The contrast with the Inanna Dumuzi cycle is then either a special exception for divine beings, which the mainstream reading holds, or evidence that the system the texts describe had a broader architecture than any single text fully reveals. The clay fragment CBS 10673, the Ziusudra flood tablet, which predates the Babylonian Atrahasis flood narrative, describes the restoration of the Mes after the flood had swept over, after the killing flood had swept over the land, after kingship had descended from heaven. Exalted crown and throne of kingship were lowered from heaven. The Mes, the fundamental principles of civilization, descend again. The me of the underworld is among them. The knowledge of how death works is reinstated. If the knowledge was preserved through the flood and reinstated afterward, and if the flood itself was a cosmic disruption of an established order rather than a permanent change to that order's structure, the implication is that the underworld's mechanics, the seven gates, the Anunnaki judges, the Giddim, the Kispam obligations, are not historically contingent arrangements, but aspects of a structure that persists across cosmic upheaval. They were present before the flood and reinstated after it. They are, in Sumerian terms, fundamental. Whether individual Giddim within that structure underwent a process of return and re-embodiment is the question the texts do not answer. What they do establish, with considerable consistency, is that the individual Giddim was not destroyed. It persisted in Iakala, sustained by the efforts of the living, subject to the authority of the Anunnaki, and part of an ongoing cosmic architecture that transcended individual lifetimes. What happened to a Giddim in the deeper arc of that architecture, whether it was eventually released, absorbed, transformed, or returned, the tablets, as far as we have them, choose not to say. That silence is itself worth sitting with. Knowledge or invention, what the pattern suggests. The evidence examined in the preceding chapters spans a range of Sumerian and Babylonian texts assembled from fragments held across multiple continents, excavated across multiple generations of scholarship, translated and retranslated through a century and a half of disciplined academic labour. Before attempting any synthesis, it is worth acknowledging the nature of what that evidence actually is. Not a uniform body of doctrine, but a collection of compositions written at different times, for different purposes, by different scribes who shared a broad cosmological tradition but were not obligated to absolute consistency in every detail. The synthesis offered here is one reading of a pattern, not a declaration of certainty. With that acknowledgement, the pattern is the following. The Sumerian textual record presents an account of post-death consciousness that is, across its major compositions, remarkably internally consistent. The Giddim, the surviving self, departs the body at death. It is guided to the underworld through a series of defined thresholds. It undergoes a procedural assessment by designated judges, the Anunnaki 7, whose evaluation determines its initial status in the realm below. Its ongoing condition in that realm is sustained or diminished by the behaviour of living descendants, who are obligated to maintain regular food and water offerings and to pronounce the dead person's name. The Giddim retains full self-awareness, memory, emotional experience, and social identity. It can be distressed, comforted, angry, or at peace. It can be recalled temporarily through specific procedures. It can, in exceptional cases, be returned to the upper world through mechanisms that involve substitution, specific substances, and the knowledge held by Enki. And it persists in the underworld in conditions that are calibrated not by abstract moral judgment, but by the specific social and relational circumstances of the life that preceded death. 3 broad interpretive frameworks have been proposed for what this pattern represents, and none of them can be definitively excluded on the basis of available evidence. The first framework is the conventional scholarly one. These texts are religious mythology serving social and psychological functions. The Giddim concept reinforced family cohesion and funerary obligations. The underworld description gave form to the terror of death and made it manageable by providing a structured map. The Anunnaki's role as judges expressed the need for cosmic order to extend beyond life. The Kispam obligations integrated the dead into the ongoing social economy and provided a mechanism for grief that kept communities functioning across generations. Under this reading, the Sumerians invented these accounts in response to the universal human need to give death a shape and meaning. The sophistication of the system reflects the sophistication of the civilization, not the reality of an afterlife. The second framework is one that a smaller number of scholars have engaged with more cautiously. These texts may encode a preserved philosophical or psychological wisdom about the nature of consciousness and the structure of the self. The 7-gate stripping sequence under this reading is not fiction but an encoded description of what contemplative traditions in many cultures have independently described. The layers of self that dissolve in the process of dying, moving from social identity to relational identity to creative, capacity to desire to will, to perceptual structure, to embodied form. The Giddim as the surviving core beneath these layers corresponds to what various contemplative traditions have described as the essential witness consciousness, the aware presence that precedes and outlasts its specific contents. Under this reading, the Sumerians were not inventing mythology, but recording the results of careful observation. possibly accumulated across generations of what we might call contemplative investigation of the dying process. The third framework is the one the texts themselves seem to invite, and the one that is most difficult to evaluate. These texts are records, in the Sumerians' own framing, of knowledge that was transmitted to them rather than discovered by them. The mere descent to the underworld and descent from the underworld was, in the Sumerian account, a divine gift. The procedure at the seven gates was not metaphor, it was the procedure. The Anunnaki were not symbolic archetypes, they were the seven judges who looked at you when you arrived. The food was bitter and the water was brackish, not because scribes needed a literary detail, but because that was what was there. This third framework cannot be confirmed by the evidence as it stands. It also cannot be dismissed by it. The consistency of the account across independent texts, the procedural specificity that exceeds what mythology typically requires, and the Sumerians' own insistence that this knowledge was preserved rather than invented, these are not proof of anything, but they are patterns. And patterns in archaeology, as in any investigative discipline, are worth following until they lead somewhere definitive or until they simply end. The strongest objection to the second and third frameworks is epistemological. We have no means of verifying any claim about what happens to consciousness after death. The Sumerian texts describe it. We cannot independently check their description. Everything beyond what the clay says is interpretation. This objection is valid and important. The appropriate response is not to dismiss the texts as fiction and not to accept them as literal fact, but to hold them as what they are. Documents from a civilization that took this question seriously enough to encode the answer in thousands of clay tablets and distribute it across a curriculum. That scribes trained for years to master. The scribes who copied these texts were not casual. They were professional. They trained in schools that maintained these compositions across centuries, correcting, refining, standardizing. The canonical version of Inanna's Descent, assembled from 50 plus fragments, shows signs of careful editing. The repetitions are precise. The formulaic responses at each gate are exact. The procedural sequence is consistent. This is not the variability of oral mythology preserved in writing. It is the consistency of a tradition that cared about accuracy. Whatever the Sumerians were being accurate about, whether it was a cosmological truth, a philosophical insight, or a social construct, they were being accurate with considerable effort and discipline. The clay holds what they decided was worth preserving. It is 4,000 years old. It is still legible. If the tablets are right, implications. Every investigation of this kind eventually arrives at the conditional statement that follows: if, not a conclusion, a consideration, an open door into a corridor of implications that can be explored without committing to any particular destination. If the Sumerian account of post-death consciousness reflects something other than social invention, if it preserves, in the form of procedural instruction encoded in mythological narrative, an actual understanding of what happens to the self after the body stops, then several things follow from it that are worth examining carefully. The first implication concerns the nature of the self during life. The Sumerian model, as described throughout this investigation, distributes the components of the self across multiple layers. The social administrative identity removed at the first gate, the relational identity removed at the second, the generative capacity at the third, the power of drawing and desire at the fourth, the will and executive function at the fifth, the capacity to order and measure at the sixth, and the outermost garment of embodied form at the seventh. What remains after this stripping, the Giddim itself, is not nothing. It is the core persisting awareness that was present beneath all these layers. Under this model, those layers were never the self. They were the clothing of the self. The self was always something smaller and more essential than all of them combined. This has an implication for how the Sumerians may have understood the purpose of embodied life. If the Giddim is the divine element derived from Enki's design and the blood of the Anunnaki, and if embodied life is a temporary condition in which that divine element is clothed in the 7 layers of social, relational, creative, desiring, willing, ordering embodied existence, then the question of what embodied life is for takes on a different cast. The Sumerian texts generally describe human beings as created to serve the gods, to do the labour the Anunnaki were unwilling to do. But the creation texts also describe human beings as given a divine giddim that will outlast the body. Something divine was placed inside an earthen vessel designed for labour. The relationship between those two facts, the servant function and the divine consciousness element, is one the tablets raise without resolving. The second implication concerns the role of the Anunnaki in the larger structure. In the afterlife texts, the Anunnaki are judges. In the creation texts, the Anunnaki are the beings whose labour was replaced by human labour. In the administrative texts of the divine hierarchy, the Anunnaki are the major gods who collectively govern cosmic order. If these 3 functions are facets of the same entities, and the textual tradition consistently treats them as such, then the Anunnaki occupy a position in the Sumerian cosmological model that is deeply interlocked with humanity's entire existence. They created humanity or authorized its creation. They define the conditions of human life, the me of civilization, and they judge what happens to human consciousness after that life ends. The beginning, the structure, and the ending of human existence in the Sumerian account all pass through the same set of divine entities. The implication this raises, and it is a question, not a claim, is whether the Sumerian model describes something closer to a design system than a natural one. The giddim does not simply arise spontaneously from the human body and make its own way. It is guided to the underworld by Ninurzu, son of the goddess of healing. It passes through gates administered by a named gatekeeper. It faces judges whose gaze is itself a transformative force. Its ongoing condition is maintained by a ritual system, the Kispum, whose mechanics were part of the me distributed from Enki's house. If the system as described is real, it is not chaos, it is administration, and administration implies design. The Sumerian king list, with its pre-flood kings who reigned for implausibly long periods before kingship was swept away by the flood, introduces a further complication. The Weld Blundell prism describes a world before the flood in which the conditions of existence, including the conditions of governance, were different in kind from those that followed. After the flood, kingship descended again from heaven. The me were reinstated. The procedure of death and afterlife, as part of those me, was restored. If the afterlife system was disrupted by the flood and restored afterward, its current form may be a reconstruction, which means it may have had an earlier form or a different form in the world before the flood. The texts that would describe that earlier form, if they existed, have not survived. This is where the investigative trail, followed as honestly as possible through the primary sources, reaches its natural limit. The clay fragments in museum drawers hold what was preserved. What was not preserved, the texts that may have been lost in the collapse of the cities, the knowledge that was oral and never written, the records from before the flood if they were real, is an absence that cannot be filled. Every investigation of this kind eventually arrives at the edge of what the evidence supports and faces the open country beyond it. Knowledge or inference, 3 readings side by side. Before the final reflection, it is worth holding all 3 interpretive frameworks in view simultaneously and giving each its full due, not to resolve among them, but to understand what each claims and what each requires. The pure mythology reading holds that the Sumerian afterlife texts are sophisticated cultural products designed to serve social functions. The Kispum obligations maintained family cohesion. The underworld architecture gave form to mortality's formlessness. The Anunnaki's judicial role expressed the need for cosmic order. The Giddim concept provided continuity of identity across the threshold of death, making the dead socially present and manageable. Under this reading, the Sumerians were not describing a reality beyond human experience. They were constructing a framework within which human experience, including the experience of death and loss, could be organised and survive. This reading does not require the Giddim to be real. It requires only that the Giddim concept was useful and that the Sumerians were skilled enough to make it architecturally consistent. The encoded wisdom reading holds that the Sumerian texts preserve insights about consciousness that are not mythology in the dismissive sense, but genuine philosophical and perhaps contemplative discoveries. The 7 gate stripping sequence corresponds to a phenomenology of consciousness dissolution that experienced practitioners of contemplative traditions in multiple cultures have independently described. The Giddim as the persisting core beneath all layers of social relational embodied identity corresponds to what various traditions have called the witness, the awareness, the Atman, the Buddha nature. Under this reading, the Sumerians were not inventing these descriptions. They were reporting something that can, in principle, be investigated, something about the actual structure of consciousness. The mythological container held a philosophical payload. The historical record reading holds that the Sumerians were, in their own framing and to the best of their ability, describing what actually happens. The descent of Inanna, the ghost report of Enkidu, the judicial function of the Anunnaki, these are records of a cosmic system that the Sumerians believed existed and that they had been given knowledge of by entities they called the Anunnaki and by the Me system distributed from Enki's house at Eridu. Under this reading, the tablets are not mythology, not philosophy, but cosmological documentation. The accuracy of that documentation cannot be verified through contemporary scientific methods, but the record itself has a consistency that exceeds what cultural invention typically produces. The honest position is that all 3 readings explain some aspects of the evidence and fail to fully explain others. The pure mythology reading struggles to account for the procedural specificity, the named gates, the named gatekeepers, the specific substances of revival, the tiered conditions organised by specific social variables that exceeds what social function requires. The encoded wisdom reading struggles to account for the administrative detail, the gift list to specific underworld deities, the specific role of Namtar in individual death, the substitution mechanics that exceeds what philosophical allegory needs. The historical record reading struggles to account for its own unverifiability. If it is a record, it describes something entirely outside the reach of contemporary investigation, which makes it neither confirmable nor falsifiable by present means. What none of the 3 readings can dismiss is the scale of the investment. 60,000 tablets from Nippur alone, trained scribes copying these compositions for years in scribal schools. The Kisbum institutionalized as a royal administrative function, royal tombs equipped with enough provisions for a court, a grief structure embedded in monthly lunar ritual extending across generations of obligation. Whatever the Sumerians were maintaining, whether it was a social fiction, a philosophical framework, or a record of actual cosmological facts, they were maintaining it with the commitment of people who believed it mattered in the deepest sense possible. That level of commitment does not prove the content, but it does make the question serious. The question the clay still holds. Come back to the beginning. Come back to the museum basement, to the drawer, to the fragment of clay the colour of old bone. N2986. A palm-sized piece of a story that was already 400 years old when the scribe who copied it was born. The scribe pressed the wedges into wet clay with a reed stylus in a room in a city called Nippur, in a land that no longer exists above the surface of the earth. The city was buried. The scribe was buried. The clay was buried for nearly 4,000 years. And then the earth gave it back. The fragment is still there in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. If you went to see it, and you could, it is part of a collection that has been studied for over a century you would see the impressions in the clay. They look like tiny birds' feet, compressed in rows, following a grammar that took scholars generations to decode. What those marks say, when decoded, is, this is what happens to what you are after your body stops. Whether that is true in the way the Sumerians believed it was true, whether the Giddim actually persists, whether the 7 gates actually strip the layers of the self, whether the Anunnaki actually sit in judgment in some realm below the earth. These are questions that this investigation cannot answer and will not pretend to answer. The clay does not answer them either. What the clay does is testify. It testifies that these questions were taken seriously by some of the first literate human beings who ever lived, that they encoded their answers with as much care as they could, that they distributed those answers through their scribal schools, their religious institutions, their royal archives and their funerary practices as something that needed to be preserved. Irving Finkel, scholar and keeper of cuneiform collections at the British Museum, once observed that there is no other reason to place objects of value in a grave unless one believes the person placed there will need them. The beads in the Eridu graves dated to 5400 BC, the golden headdress in Queen Puabi's tomb, the donkeys buried with Ur-Nama, the jewellery and weapons that Ur-Nama carried as gifts for the lords of the underworld. All of this material, across 5,000 years of Mesopotamian history, says the same thing in the same language. There is something that continues. The Sumerians did not know exactly what shape that continuation took, in the sense that no two compositions describe it with perfect uniformity. The underworld of the death of Ur-Nama, where a banquet is held and gifts are exchanged, and the king is eventually given a judicial position of authority, is somewhat different in atmosphere from the underworld of the Enkidu survey, where the quality of existence is calibrated precisely to the number of one's surviving sons. The 7 gates of Inanna's descent, with their relentless procedural stripping, have a different emotional register than the ghost of Enkidu rising briefly through a hole in the earth to report to his living friend. The texts were not trying to be systematic in the way that modern philosophical or theological writing attempts to be systematic. They were, each in their own way, circling the same immense question from different angles, trying to describe something that by definition exceeds the capacity of language to contain it. What they agree on across all their variations is this: you are more than your body. You are more than your social position, your garments of office, your ornaments of relationship, your golden ring of authority, your measuring rod and line. Strip all of these away, pass through 7 gates, arrive before 7 judges, and something remains. Something that remembers, something that feels, something that is sustained by being remembered in turn. The Anunnaki's answer, as preserved in the clay, is not a comfortable one. It is not a promise of paradise. It is not a threat of punishment. It is, in its own way, something more demanding than either. A description of a system in which what happens to your consciousness after death depends substantially on what you did with your consciousness while alive, not in the abstract moral sense of whether you were good or bad, but in the concrete relational sense of whether you built the networks of care and remembrance that would sustain your Giddim when you arrived in the land of no return. You carry yourself across the threshold. Stripped of everything external, the Giddim carries only what it actually is. And what it actually is, the divine element mixed with clay, the spark from the blood of the Anunnaki, the thing that persists when the clothing is gone, that is what stands before the judge's gaze. The text says that gaze was a look of death, but Inanna arose from it. The corpse was sprinkled with the life-giving plant and the life-giving water, and she arose. Whether that is metaphor or record or something that defies the boundary between the two, the clay does not say. The clay simply holds the question, baked hard, wedge by wedge, waiting for whoever arrives at it next with enough quiet to really hear what it is asking. You are listening from wherever you are, in whatever dark or quiet hour this is. The tablets are still there. The questions are still open. The underworld is still described in detail in a dead language on fragments of baked earth that survived the collapse of everything that surrounded them. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the questions settle like dust in still air, like the fine Mesopotamian silt that covered Nepal for 4,000 years and preserved, in its weight and darkness, everything we have been reading. Sleep in that.